Good evening. You're listening to Quiet Sleep Cat, a quiet place for gentle stories, slow nights, and warm rest. You do not need to follow every detail. You do not need to stay fully awake. Just let the story move softly around you. Let the night carry the rest. Tonight, we return once more to Moonlight Town. The bakery is nearing closing time, and for the first time, Nora will be the one who finishes the evening alone. The bread is cooling. The lamps are low. Mrs. Imai is still there for a little while longer. The bakery was still open, but the busiest part of the day had already passed. Only a few loaves remained on the front shelf. The larger baskets had been emptied and stacked near the wall. A thin layer of flour still softened one corner of the broad work table. Nora stood beside the cooling rack with a clean cloth over one arm. She had worked in the bakery for several months now, long enough to know the sound of the oven door closing properly, long enough to tell which loaves were cool enough to wrap, long enough to recognize Mrs. Imai's footsteps without looking up. Mrs. Imai crossed behind her carrying 2 empty trays. "Those can stay on the lower rack," she said. "I was going to put them there." "I know." Nora smiled and slid the trays into place. Outside, the bakery street had begun to turn deep blue. The front window still held warm light, but fewer footsteps passed beyond it now. Mrs. Imai wiped the counter once and folded the cloth. "I'll leave after the next half hour," she said. Nora looked over. "Still going to dinner?" "I said I would." "You usually say that, and then find 3 more things to do." Mrs. Imai considered the accusation. "That has happened." Tonight, though, there was no reason for her to stay. An old friend on the upper road had invited her to supper several days ago. Nothing special was being celebrated. It was simply a meal she had agreed to attend. Nora already knew what that meant. She would finish the final part of the evening, serve whoever came before closing, put away what should be saved, lower the oven, check the cloths, turn down the lamps, lock the front door. Breath in and out. None of those jobs were new. Nora had done every one of them before. Usually, Mrs. Imai had been somewhere else in the room while she did them. Sometimes behind the counter, sometimes near the oven, sometimes saying nothing at all. That was the only real difference tonight. When the last task came, there would not be another pair of hands in the bakery. Mrs. Imai opened the lower cupboard and checked the flour sack. "Enough for morning," she said. Nora looked at it too. "Yes." Mrs. Imai closed the door. A customer entered and bought 2 small rolls. Nora wrapped them, accepted the coins, and returned the change without asking for help. Mrs. Imai only continued stacking trays. When the customer left, the little bell above the door gave one soft sound. The bakery became quiet again. For now, Mrs. Imai was still there. The closing belonged to both of them for another few minutes. Nora noticed that this made the remaining work feel very ordinary. Nothing had suddenly become harder. The same shelves, trays, and cloths waited in the same places they always did. Only the person who would make the final small decisions was changing. Then Mrs. Imai set a folded list on the work table and rested one finger lightly beside it. Mrs. Imai rested one finger beside the folded list. Nora looked down at it. There were only 6 short lines. Not a full page. Not a careful set of instructions. Just the ordinary closing points they both already knew. Remaining bread, Nora read. Cooling rack, Mrs. Imai said. Cloths. Oven. Front lamp. Door. Nora looked up. That is less of a list than usual. It is the same list as usual. You normally say more things around it. Mrs. Imai folded her arms. Would you like more things? No. The answer came quickly enough to make them both smile. Mrs. Imai pointed toward the front shelf. Anything sold before closing gets wrapped normally. And whatever is left? Nora asked. You know, tomorrow board, if it will keep. Mrs. Imai nodded. Nora continued before she could explain the next part. Cooling bread stays out until there is no warmth in the center. Yes. The wet cloth hangs by the back wall. Yes. Oven to low, then off after the rack is done. Yes. Front lamp last. Almost last. Nora touched the folded list. Door last. Mrs. Imai nodded again. There was nothing left to teach in the order itself. Nora knew the steps. Breath in and out. The oven gave a low metal sound as it cooled slightly. Nora turned her head toward it by habit. Mrs. Imai noticed. You heard it. I know that sound. Good. On the cooling rack were 8 small loaves from the final batch. They had been baked later than usual because the afternoon had been busy. Their crusts were firm, but a little warmth still remained inside. Nora touched the side of one loaf with the back of her fingers. Not yet. Not yet, Mrs. Imai agreed. They moved to the counter together. 2 plain loaves remained on the sales shelf. One was smaller and softer. The other had a firmer crust and would keep easily until morning. Nora looked between them. If no one buys the firmer one, I put it on tomorrow's board. Yes. And the soft one? Depends when the last customer comes. Nora frowned slightly. That was not on the list. Most evenings are not entirely on the list. The sentence was practical, not mysterious. Nora had already seen that many times. A loaf cooled slower. A cloth stayed damp. Someone arrived 5 minutes before closing. The order stayed the same, but the small choices moved around it. Mrs. Imai took the folded list and slid it toward Nora. You can keep it on the table. I know the list. I know. Nora left it there anyway. It was small enough not to feel like supervision. just a piece of paper beside the flour jar. Outside, another pair of footsteps approached the bakery. The bell sounded when the door opened. Nora turned toward the counter before Mrs. Imai did. The evening was moving forward one ordinary customer at a time. And soon, the list on the work table would belong to Nora alone. The new customer chose one small loaf and a pair of rolls. Nora wrapped them in paper. Mrs. Imai remained near the oven and did not step closer. "Anything else?" Nora asked. "No, thank you." The customer paid and wished them good night. Nora returned the change. The bell sounded again as the door closed. Only one plain loaf remained on the sales shelf now. The firmer loaf was still beside it. Nora looked at both. If someone comes for bread right at closing, should I sell the firmer one too? Mrs. Imai looked at her. What would you do tomorrow morning if you did? Bake more. You will anyway. Nora considered this. Then yes. Mrs. Imai smiled faintly. What do you think? Nora looked back at the loaf. If the soft one is still here, sell that first. Keep the firmer loaf if morning stock is low. That sounds reasonable. Nora nodded, then immediately looked toward the cloth rack. And if the long cloth is still damp, hang it, even if it is not dry. It is a cloth, Nora. Nora laughed quietly. I know. Do you? Yes. Mrs. Imai lifted her coat from a wall hook and laid it across the back of a chair. Nora noticed the movement. The leaving was becoming real now. One more question, Nora said. Mrs. Imai waited. If the small batch is still warm after closing, I keep the oven low until it cools? No, the oven does not help bread cool. Nora looked embarrassed for half a second. I know that too. Yes. Mrs. Imai stepped closer to the work table. She unfolded the closing list once, then folded it again. Breath in and out. Nora. Yes? If it is ready for morning, it is ready enough. Nora looked at the 6-line list. Remaining bread, cooling rack, cloths, oven, front lamp, door. None of those words said perfect. None said every surface must be checked twice. None said the cloth had to be dry before anyone could go home. Ready for morning, Nora repeated. That is the point. Mrs. Imai buttoned her coat. Nora looked toward the front window. The street was darker now. They were close to the hour when the bakery normally began its final closing steps. Will you come back later? Nora asked. No. The answer was immediate. Nora turned toward her. Mrs. Imai adjusted one sleeve. I am going to dinner. Then I am going home. You are really leaving me the closing. I thought that was the idea. There was no ceremony in the sentence, no test, no promise that Nora would perform perfectly. Mrs. Imai simply trusted the routine they had already practiced together. She picked up her small bag. Then she paused beside the counter. You know where the spare key is? Yes. You will not need it. I know. Mrs. Imai looked toward the cooling rack once. Then she deliberately looked away. Ready for morning, she said again. Nora nodded. Mrs. Imai reached for the front door. Mrs. Imai reached for the front door. The little bell gave one familiar sound as she opened it. Cool evening air entered the bakery. Good night, Nora. Good night. Mrs. Imai stepped onto the stone street. Then she turned back only long enough to pull the door gently closed behind her. The bell sounded again. Her footsteps moved away from the bakery. They passed the front window. Then they disappeared toward the upper road. For several seconds, Nora stood behind the counter without moving. Nothing in the bakery had changed. The same loaves waited on the shelf. The same cooling rack stood near the oven. The same cloth hung beside the sink. And yet, the room sounded different. Not empty. Not lonely. Only more clearly hers to finish. Breath in and out. The oven gave another quiet, cooling sound. Nora turned toward it. This time, no one else turned too. She walked to the rack and touched one of the small loaves. Still warm, not ready. She looked toward the 6-line list. Then she did not pick it up. The first thing was obvious. Serve the bakery until closing. Everything else could wait behind that. Nora straightened the front counter. She moved the remaining soft loaf a little closer to the glass. The firmer loaf stayed behind it. A chair near the wall sat at a slight angle. Nora almost moved it. Then she noticed footsteps outside. The bell rang. A woman from the lower road entered and asked for 2 rolls. Nora greeted her normally. She wrapped the rolls. She took payment. She returned the change. "How late are you open tonight?" the woman asked. "Not much longer." "Mrs. Imai left early?" She did. The woman nodded, as if that were completely ordinary. "Then good night." "Good night." The customer left. The bell settled. Nora looked at the clock on the bakery wall. There was still time for another customer. She returned to the rack, still warm. The cloth near the sink had already begun to dry along one edge. The oven was steady. The front lamp still gave enough light for the street. Nothing needed a decision yet. Nora found that reassuring. She folded one paper wrapper, then another. She placed them beside the counter for whoever might come next. The room no longer felt strange without Mrs. Imai. It only felt more noticeable. Each sound had a little more space around it. Nora could hear the bakery settling without needing to fill that space. Then the doorbell rang again. Nora turned toward the next customer. Before moving, she noticed one last small difference in herself. She did not glance toward the place where Mrs. Imai usually stood. There was no need. The counter was hers to manage for the rest of the evening, and the next customer was simply another customer. She stepped forward, and the first part of her own closing truly began. The bell rang again. An older man from the bridge road entered with a folded cloth bag beneath one arm. Nora knew him well enough to know what he usually bought. "One small loaf?" she asked. "If there is one." "There is." She reached for the softer loaf on the front shelf. The firmer loaf remained behind it. Nora wrapped the softer one in paper and placed it inside the man's cloth bag. "Mrs. Imai gone for the evening?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you get the last hour." "It seems so." He paid, wished her good night, and left without offering advice. The bell gave a light sound above him. Nora looked at the front shelf. Now only the firmer loaf remained. Behind the counter were several small rolls that would still be good tonight, but were not meant for tomorrow's main shelf. The bakery suddenly looked closer to closing, not because the clock had moved much, because there was less to sell. Breath in and out. Nora touched the cooling rack again. The small loaves were cooler along the crust, still warmer in the center. She returned to the counter. A younger woman entered a few minutes later and asked for 3 rolls. Nora counted them into a small paper bag. "Anything else?" "No, that is enough." The words stayed with Nora for no special reason. That is enough. It was a phrase customers used every day. 1 loaf was enough. 3 rolls were enough. No one asked the bakery to give them every piece on the shelf. The customer left. Nora counted the coins in the small till. She did not close it yet. There were still a few minutes before the front door officially stopped opening for customers. The firmer loaf sat alone on the shelf. Nora considered moving it to the tomorrow board now. Then she stopped herself. Closing time had not arrived. Someone might still want it. She did not need to decide early simply because Mrs. Imai was not there. Some decisions became easier when they were allowed to arrive at their proper time. Nora wiped a small patch of flour from the counter. She folded the cloth once. Then she left another faint flour mark near the work table alone. The bakery was still working. It did not need to look closed before it was closed. Outside, the street lamps had grown brighter against the deep blue road. A pair of footsteps passed without stopping. Then the street became quiet. Nora looked at the clock again. 5 minutes. She resisted the urge to look at the list. Remaining bread, cooling rack, cloths, oven, front lamp, door. She knew it. The bell did not ring again for 2 minutes. Then someone approached from the post office side. Nora saw the familiar coat through the window before the door opened. The old post office clerk stepped inside later than he usually did. He looked toward the nearly empty shelf, and Nora looked at the last loaf waiting there. Nora looked at the last loaf waiting on the front shelf. The post office clerk had not reached the counter yet. For one moment, she assumed the decision had arrived. Then he stopped beside the rolls instead. anything small left? A few rolls. That will do. Nora relaxed without realizing she had been holding the question in her shoulders. She placed 2 rolls in a paper bag. The clerk looked at the remaining loaf. Saving that? I think so. Then save it. His answer was not permission. He was only telling her he did not need it. Nora accepted the coins and closed the till after returning the change. The clock showed closing time. The clerk tucked the paper bag into one coat pocket. You are closing tonight? Yes. First time? First time alone. He nodded. Then I should leave before I become part of the procedure. Nora smiled. That would help. He wished her good night. The bell sounded as he left. Nora watched the door close. No other footsteps were approaching. The front window reflected more of the bakery than the street now. Breath in and out. She turned the small sign at the door to show the bakery was closed. The action was simple. She had done it before while Mrs. Imai stood nearby. Tonight, the sign stayed in Nora's hand for 1 extra second. Then she let it hang flat against the glass. Now the last loaf needed an answer. Nora lifted it from the shelf. The crust was firm. Its weight felt normal. It had been baked early enough to cool fully. It would keep well overnight. She carried it to the small board where morning stock was placed. Beside the board was a clean cloth. Nora laid the loaf down and covered it loosely. That was the decision. No one said yes. No one checked it. Nora looked at the covered shape. She imagined Mrs. Imai arriving in the morning. Would she agree? Probably. The thought lingered. Then Nora noticed what she was doing. The loaf had already been placed where tomorrow's loaf belonged. It was suitable for morning. There was nothing else to ask. The decision did not become more correct by imagining someone else approving it. Nora turned away from the board. The cooling rack waited next. She touched the side of one small loaf. Much cooler now. Still a little warm at the center. Not ready yet. That answer was also clear. She glanced at the closing list, but did not move toward it. Remaining bread had been decided. The front counter was finished for customers. Nora moved the empty sales basket beneath the counter. She brushed away crumbs from the shelf. Then she stopped before wiping it a second time. One part of the closing was done. Not perfectly, not ceremonially, simply done. Nora left the covered loaf on the morning board and walked back toward the rack, where the bread still needed a little more time. Nora reached the cooling rack just as the front bell rang once more. She turned quickly. The sign already showed closed. For half a second, she wondered whether she had locked the door too early. Then she saw the post office clerk through the glass again. He had returned. Nora opened the door. Did you forget something? The rolls. He held up the empty hand that should have been carrying the paper bag. I left them on your counter. Nora looked back. The small bag sat exactly where he had paid. There they are. I suspected as much. Nora handed him the bag. The clerk took it and glanced toward the morning board. The covered loaf rested beneath the cloth. You saved it? Yes. Good night, then. Nora almost laughed. That is all? That is all. He left again. The bell sounded once. This time, Nora locked the front door after him. Not because something might happen, because the bakery was closed now. Breath in and out. Nora stood with one hand on the lock. She tested it once. Secure. Then she returned to the rack. The small interruption had not changed anything important. The loaf for morning was still there. The last rolls had gone with the person who bought them. The bakery was officially closed to customers. Nora touched the center of the nearest loaf on the cooling rack. Still warm. She looked at the clock. The batch had been cooling longer than usual. Mrs. Imai sometimes judged by time. More often, she judged by touch. Nora lifted one loaf and held it for a few seconds. The bottom still carried a little warmth. If she wrapped it now, moisture might stay inside. Not yet, she said quietly. No one answered. The decision felt firmer because it did not need an answer. She set the loaf back on the rack. The oven was already lower. There was no active baking left. The cooling bread could wait in ordinary room air. Nora moved one tray farther apart from another to let air pass between them. Then she stepped back. There was nothing else to do to the bread itself. Waiting was part of the process. The bakery had become very quiet after the second closing of the door. Nora could hear the faint sound of the street beyond the glass. A cartwheel farther away. A door closing across the road. She looked around for the next task. The cooling rack said, "Wait." The covered loaf said, "Finished." The front counter said, "Closed." Nora turned toward the rest of the room, where smaller jobs were still available while the bread cooled. There was a useful calm in having no customer waiting and no urgent decision in front of her. She could choose one ordinary task, finish it, and then return to the rack. The closing did not need to race the clock. It only needed to move at the pace the bakery itself required. The cooling rack still held a little warmth. Nora knew the bread would be ready. She simply did not know whether it would be ready in 5 minutes or 15. That uncertainty was small. Still, it changed the closing order. Normally, the cooling rack would be wrapped before some of the other tasks. Tonight, it would come later. Nora touched another loaf. Its crust was cool. The base was not. She left it alone. Breath in and out. The broad work table still held a few flour marks. Nora brushed them into one small pile. She wiped the table with a dry cloth. The wood appeared darker where the cloth passed. She did not scrub every seam. Morning work would cover the table with flour again. Next came the cups used during the afternoon. 3 were already clean beside the sink. Nora dried them and placed them on the lower shelf. A flour sack near the pantry door had folded inward at the top. She rolled the edge and tied it loosely. Then she returned to the rack. Still warm. Nora almost checked the wall clock again. Instead, she held the loaf for a moment longer. The answer was in the bread, not the minute hand. Not ready. She set it back. Closing was not always a straight line from one item to the next. Sometimes one task simply needed to wait while another became possible. Nora moved to the cloth rack. 2 dry cloths could be folded and stored. 1 damp cloth remained near the sink. She picked it up and felt the heavier corner. Not dry. That could wait too. She hung it wider over the bar. The bakery now contained 2 unfinished things: cooling bread, a damp cloth. Neither was a problem. Nora returned to the oven. The heat had dropped to the level Mrs. Imai usually used near closing. She checked the control once. Correct. No flame needed adjustment. No tray remained inside. The cooling bread had nothing to do with the oven now. Nora smiled faintly at the question she had asked Mrs. Imai earlier. She looked toward the front lamp. Still too early to lower it completely. The bakery was closed, but the light made the room comfortable while she worked. The list on the work table remained folded. Nora had not touched it since Mrs. Imai left. She considered opening it. Then she heard herself naming the points without looking. Bread, rack, cloths, oven, lamp, door. The door was locked. The oven was lowered. The cloth was hanging. The bread was waiting. Nora realized that the closing was already happening, even though the rack had refused to follow the exact timetable she expected. The room had not lost its order. That mattered more than she expected. She had always thought of closing as a familiar sequence, almost like shelves on a wall. One item followed another. Tonight, the sequence had loosened without becoming confusing. The bakery was still moving toward rest. It had simply chosen a slightly different order. She returned to the work table and looked for what could be done while waiting. Nora looked across the work table for what could be done while the bread cooled. There was less than she expected. A spoon near the sink needed drying. She dried it. A small jar of salt stood too close to the table edge. She moved it back to the shelf. 2 empty paper bags lay beneath the counter. She stacked them with the others. Then she paused. Breath in and out. The quiet after a working day had begun to reveal itself. During business hours, there was always another obvious motion. A customer, a tray, a loaf, a coin. Now each finished task left an open space behind it. Nora wiped the counter where the last roll bag had rested. It was already clean. She wiped once anyway. Then she stopped before wiping again. The cooling rack still needed time. Waiting did not require replacing that time with unnecessary work. Nora walked to the back shelf. Tomorrow's flour measure was already there. Mrs. Imai had prepared it earlier. Nora almost lifted the lid to check. She had watched Mrs. Imai measure it. There was no reason to open it. She left the lid closed. On the next shelf, a basket leaned slightly to one side. Nora straightened it. Then another basket looked crooked because the first was now straight. She adjusted that too. The shelf looked neat. Perhaps a little too neat for a bakery that would begin working again before sunrise. Nora smiled and stepped away. She returned to the cooling rack. This time, the loaf felt almost completely cool. A faint warmth remained only at the thickest part. Almost, she said. The word did not mean failure. It did not mean more work. It only meant almost. Nora moved to the cloth rack again. The damp cloth had dried along most of its surface. One folded corner remained slightly cool and wet. She unfolded it wider. Then she caught herself watching it, as if it might finish drying while she stood there. Cloths did not respond to supervision. Neither did cooling bread. The thought made her laugh quietly. She walked back toward the front of the bakery. The street outside was nearly empty now. Warm light from one house rested across the lower stones. Nora had never noticed how slowly the bakery became a closed room. It was not one switch. It was many small motions stopping one after another. Customer voices first, then paper wrappers, then the till. Soon, the cooling rack. Later, the front lamp. The evening did not need Nora to fill every silence between those endings. She let one of those silences remain. For several breaths, she simply stood near the front window, hearing the bakery settle around her without adding another movement. She turned from the window and walked back toward the damp cloth, which had become the next small thing she was tempted to solve completely. The damp cloth still held one cool corner. Nora lifted it from the bar. She shook it once and spread it across a wider section. The center was nearly dry. The edge was not. She moved it closer to the warmer side of the room. Then she stopped. Mrs. Imai had said to hang it, not to make sure every thread was dry before leaving. Nora returned the cloth to the back wall, where air could move around it. She spread it flat. That was enough. Breath in and out. The phrase came back clearly. If it is ready for morning, it is ready enough. Would the cloth be ready for morning? Yes. That answer did not require the cloth to be ready now. Nora left it hanging. She did not touch it again. At the cooling rack, the final batch had reached the same point. Nora held the thickest loaf. No warmth remained at the base. The center felt cool through the crust. ready. She began wrapping the loaves loosely, one by one, not tightly enough to trap moisture, only enough to protect them overnight. The first went into the covered storage basket, then the second, the third. Nora did not rush because she had already waited. When the last small loaf was stored, the cooling rack stood empty. She carried the rack closer to the wall. One of the 6 lines on the list had just disappeared without fanfare. Cooling rack, done. The oven was next. Nora control to off. A faint settling sound came from the metal. Oven, done. Nora looked toward the cloth, still hanging, ready for morning. Cloths, done enough. She stood in the center of the bakery. The list was becoming very short now. Remaining bread had been handled. Cooling rack finished. Cloths prepared. Oven off. Only lamp and final leaving remained. Almost everything was finished. Nora looked from the empty rack to the hanging cloth. Earlier, both had seemed like reasons the closing might take longer. Now one was finished, and the other was simply waiting for morning air. She took a small drink of water and returned the cup to the lower shelf. The bakery had grown quiet enough that the wall clock could be heard clearly. Nora named the finished things once in her mind. Bread stored. Rack empty. Cloth hanging. Oven off. Only the front lamp and the final leaving remained. For this evening, the work had reached its natural edge, and nothing important remained unfinished. Nora should have felt the obvious next step. Instead, she looked around the room and wondered whether there was something she had forgotten. Nora stood in the center of the bakery and looked around. Almost everything was finished. That was clear. The sales shelf was empty, except for the loaf saved for morning. The cooling rack had been cleared. The damp cloth hung wide against the back wall. The oven was off. The till had been closed. The cups were dry. The flour sack was tied. The work table was clear enough for morning. Nora walked to the front counter anyway. She checked the shelf beneath it. Paper bags were stacked. Coins were put away. Nothing remained. She walked to the sink. No bowl waited there. No spoon. No cup. Then she looked at the tomorrow board. The covered loaf remained exactly where she had placed it. Breath in and out. Nora felt a small pull to lift the cloth and check the loaf again. She had already checked it. She left the cloth where it was. The bakery wall clock made one quiet movement. Nora returned to the work table. The folded closing list remained beside the flour jar. For the first time since Mrs. Imai left, Nora unfolded it. Remaining bread, cooling rack, cloths, oven, front lamp, door. She placed one finger beside each line. Bread, ready. Rack, ready. Cloths, ready for morning. Oven off. Front lamp still on. Door locked to customers, but not yet final because Nora was still inside. 2 steps remained. Not 6, not 10. 2. She folded the list again. Then she looked at the chair near the wall. It sat at the same slight angle it had held earlier. Nora moved it straight. The room only looked different. She moved the chair back almost to where it had been and smiled at herself. The bakery was already ready. The difficulty was no longer knowing what to do. It was believing that there was nothing else that needed doing. Nora stood beside the front shelf and let her eyes travel slowly across the room. The sight was almost too familiar. The same oven, the same counter, the same baskets and wooden table. Yet she had never before been the only person responsible for deciding that all of them could be left alone until morning. She understood now why Mrs. Imai sometimes stopped in the middle of the bakery and did nothing for a few seconds. Nora had once assumed she was remembering the next task. Perhaps sometimes she was only confirming that there was no next task worth beginning. She crossed the room once more because her feet had not yet learned the ending. Work table, oven, covered loaf, closed front door. Everything she looked at gave the same answer: ready. Still, Nora did not turn down the front lamp. Not yet. She walked back toward the counter, searching almost unconsciously for one more small thing she could improve before allowing the bakery to become fully closed. Nora reached the counter and found a spoon already lying straight beside the small tray. She moved it half an inch. Then she stopped. The spoon had not needed moving. A dry corner of the counter caught her eye. She wiped it once. The cloth came away clean. Nora looked at the cloth in her hand. There was no flour on it, no water. Nothing had been cleaned because nothing had been dirty. Breath in and out. The bakery was quiet enough that Nora could hear her own sleeve brush the counter edge. She put the dry cloth down. Near the front window, one basket leaned slightly toward another. Nora lifted it, then held it in the air. Where was she going to put it? There was no better place. She returned the basket exactly where it had been. This time she laughed, very softly. Not because she had made a mistake, because the pattern had finally become obvious. She was not finding unfinished work. She was creating tiny decisions so the closing would not have to end yet. Nora leaned both hands against the work table. The broad wooden surface had held dough, trays, bags, coins, cups, and folded cloths throughout the day. Now it held almost nothing. The folded closing list, one clean cloth, the small flour jar. That was all. Nora knew how to work. Tonight, she was learning the smaller skill of stopping. It was not laziness. It was not leaving a job unfinished. The proof was all around her. The bread was stored correctly. The oven was off. The counter was usable. The cloth would dry. Morning could begin without repairing anything she had neglected. The remaining urge to work belonged to Nora, not to the bakery. She stood there for a while without moving. No bell rang. No customer appeared. No bread needed cooling. No oven needed checking. The quiet did not contain a hidden task. Nora turned toward the back wall. The damp cloth hung safely where morning air would finish the work. She looked at the loaf beneath its cloth. No need to lift it. She looked toward the oven. Off. Then the front door. Locked to customers. The final lamp remained. Nora reached toward the work table and unfolded the closing list once more. She did not need to read all 6 lines this time. Her eyes went only to the last 2. Front lamp, door. Everything before them had already become morning ready. Nora remembered Mrs. Imai's voice without needing to imagine what she would say now. If it is ready for morning, it is ready enough. The bakery was ready for morning. For the first time all evening, Nora stopped looking for another thing. She stood beside the work table and allowed the room to remain exactly as it was. Nora remained beside the work table. The bakery did not change while she stood still. The loaf stayed beneath its cloth. The damp towel stayed on the back rail. The oven stayed off. Nothing became less ready because she stopped moving. Breath in and out. Nora folded the closing list carefully. She placed it beside the flour jar where Mrs. Imai would find it in the morning. Not as proof, not as a report, only because that was where the list belonged. She walked to the back wall and looked once at the hanging cloth, ready for morning. She looked at the storage basket holding the cooled loaves, ready for morning. The covered loaf on the tomorrow board, ready. The oven, off and cooling, ready. The work table, clear enough to receive flour again, ready. Nora did not need to say the words aloud. The room was giving her the same answer from every direction. She took her coat from the wall hook and slipped one arm inside, then the other. Her key was in the small inner pocket where she had kept it all evening. She touched it once to make sure, then left it there. Nora walked to the front window. The street outside was quiet. A low lamp across the road touched the old stones. No one was approaching the bakery. No one needed to. The working day had already ended. Only Nora had not left it yet. She lowered the front lamp slightly. The bakery became softer. The corners receded into ordinary shadow. For a moment, Nora noticed how different the room looked when it was no longer waiting for customers. Not empty, resting. She went behind the counter and placed the dry cloth in its drawer. One last practical movement. Then she stopped herself from opening another drawer. There was no reason. Nora smiled. ready for morning was not a lower standard. It was the correct ending for tonight. Nora stood for one more quiet moment with her coat on. She noticed the faint smell of bread that always remained after closing, softer now that no warm tray was moving through the room. The scent would still be there when Mrs. Imai returned before dawn. Morning did not need a perfect bakery preserved under glass. It needed a room that was clean enough, safe enough, and ready to begin again. She picked up her small bag. The lamp remained low behind her. The front door waited ahead. Nora walked toward it without looking back at the cooling rack, the cloth, or the tomorrow loaf. The next part of closing was no longer about checking the room. It was about leaving it alone. Nora reached the front door with her coat on and her small bag in one hand. The bakery behind her was quiet. She turned the front lamp down to its final setting. The warm light near the window became low and soft. There was no reason to leave a bright working lamp after everyone had gone. Nora stood beside the door. For 1 second, the old habit returned. She wanted to look over her shoulder and check everything once more. She did not. Breath in and out. The bread had been checked. The oven had been checked. The cloth had been checked. The list had been checked. Nothing became safer because she checked it a third time. Nora opened the front door. Cool night air entered the bakery. The little bell gave one clear sound above her. She stepped outside. The stone street was dry and calm. Most nearby windows were already dark. Nora pulled the bakery door closed. The bell sounded again, softer from the other side. She took the key from her pocket. The lock turned once, then fully into place. Nora tested the handle one time. Secure. That was the closing. Mrs. Imai did not appear at the end of the street. No one asked about the cloth or checked the morning loaf. The bakery stood behind its closed door with all of those things already settled. Nora did not need another person to tell her that the evening was finished. For a moment, she imagined how different this would have felt if Mrs. Imai had returned just then. Nora would probably have watched her eyes move around the room, waiting for a nod. But no one came. The street remained quiet, and that absence turned out to be useful. The locked door itself was enough evidence. Nora had made the choices, completed the closing, and reached the point where there was nothing left to hand back to anyone else. She put the key away. The low lamp inside remained visible through the glass, but only faintly. Nora looked at the door for another moment. Then she turned away. Closing the bakery had not been the final wipe of a counter. It had not been the oven switch. It had not been the last loaf stored. Tonight, closing the bakery meant leaving it closed. Nora began walking along the quiet street. Her footsteps moved away from the door. The bakery stayed where it was. At the first corner, Nora noticed the urge to remember the checklist once more. She let the thought pass. Morning would answer everything that needed answering. Until then, the bakery could remain exactly as she had left it. She continued toward the lower road at an easy pace. Behind her, the first closing she had completed alone was already becoming part of the ordinary night. Nora walked along the quiet town road with the bakery behind her. The street felt wider after a day spent inside warm rooms. A low stone wall followed one side. The bridge water could be heard farther ahead. Nora did not turn around. The bakery light was no longer something she needed to see. Breath in and out. Her steps settled into an easy pace. The small bag moved lightly beside her coat. For the first few minutes, pieces of the closing tried to return to her thoughts. The loaf beneath the cloth, the cooling rack, the damp towel, the oven. Each thought arrived with its own answer already attached. Ready. Finished. Morning. Nora did not need to solve them again. She reached the bridge road. Water moved below the stone rail in a low, steady line. A small reflection shifted beneath one lamp. The bakery was out of sight now. That made no difference to its condition. Work did not need her attention in order to remain finished. Nora walked a little farther. One house had already closed its shutters. Another still held a low kitchen light. Someone somewhere set down a cup. A door closed gently. The town was finishing many ordinary evenings at once. Nora's evening no longer belonged to the bakery. Her shoulders loosened beneath the coat. She noticed only then that she had been holding them slightly higher all night. There was nothing wrong with that. A first responsibility often stayed close for a while after the door closed. But it did not have to follow her all the way home. Breath in and out. Nora passed the lower wall. The bridge water softened behind her. Tomorrow, Mrs. Imai would open the bakery. She would see the saved loaf. She would see the dry cloth. She would begin the oven and flour and trays again. Those things belonged to morning. Tonight, Nora did not need to imagine Mrs. Imai's reaction. She did not need praise to complete the closing after it was already complete. The first quiet success was simply that Nora had turned the key and walked away. The road ahead became darker and calmer. Her steps slowed naturally. The bakery was ready for morning. Nora was ready to leave the day behind. Nothing else needed doing. Nothing else needed checking. Only the road. Only the quiet night. Only the easy distance ahead. Nora let the bakery remain behind her without looking back. Good night, and sleep well.